Let me welcome you all to NCER this morning when we have our 17th five-institution budget discussion. So 17th means that this tradition has been ongoing for the past 16 years. And the idea behind this tradition was that after early reactions on the budget have been given and processed, five think tanks come together, take their time over a few days to look at the budget from their own respective lenses and frameworks and give their own views to a wide audience. And this is exactly what we are doing today. And there are actually a few firsts we are doing in the event today. One is that it's the first time Dr. Kavita Rao is joining us. She took over as the director of NIPFP a few months ago. Deepak and I are doing our first in-person five think tank event. And it's also the very first time that we have 3 women heads of think tanks on the dais. And I don't think we have invited the chief economic advisor of the country before to this event. That's another first. It's another matter that Anant is also making sure that there is gender parity on the stage. So thanks for that, Anant. With this, I hand over to Anant, who will call on each speaker and will conduct the proceeding.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Poonam, for setting the stage and the context. So we'll go straight into the event. We will start with Ms. Poonam Gupta to my left. So each of the participants on the dais, they get 15 minutes. So there is nothing personal if I remind them that they are overshooting if I do so. So without much further ado, over to you, Poonam.
Thank you, Anant. Happy to start today's event. And what the think tanks head usually do is we change the order every year. So it's not that I'm starting today because we are the host. It's just that somebody else started it last time and somebody else will start it next time. But having said that, we also speak on issues that we consider as our comparative advantages. So for today's presentation, I'll be talking about 3 things. And my fellow panelists will likely build on the things that I talk about. So my presentation is in 3 parts. Global backdrop, against which we can assess the Indian economic outlook and against which the budget and the economic survey was prepared and presented. And after doing the global backdrop and the Indian economic outlook, I'll spend a few minutes on the budget, its specific announcements, priorities, and implications. So right away, getting to the global backdrop, as we all know, last 4 years have been very, very challenging for the global economy in every which way. There was a health crisis, there was an economic crisis, there was a geopolitical crisis. And the outcome of all these have been slow growth, high inflation, very high oil prices, which may be a boon for some of the countries which export oil, but was not the case for India, and tight monetary policies. But being through these challenges for 4 years, it seems that the worst is over. It doesn't mean that things are normalizing, it just means that perhaps more negative shocks are not anticipated. So the worst seems to be over in the sense that the IMF, in its view update that it released just a few days ago, has now said that the global recession is unlikely to be a baseline, and it has slightly revised upwards the global growth outlook. China has started to open up, a very large economy, a very large trading economy. Having retreated from its zero COVID policy, it will again be a positive for the global economic outlook. Inflation has started to taper off, but from very high levels. So in 2022, inflation globally averaged at 8.8%, a level that has not been seen in the last 3 decades, and is likely to moderate down to 6.6%. But it's really glass half full, because 6.6% is also very high from a historical perspective, which means that monetary policies around the world will remain tight. And it's only projected to again come down to 4.3% in 2024, again slightly higher than the global average of the past decades. But because the inflation has started to modulate, at least in the US, monetary policy tightening, the pace of monetary policy tightening has started to come down, which is good for emerging markets such as India. Oil prices, which really impact the oil importing countries, including India, have started to come down. They're currently in mid-80s, a level that Indians or the Indian economy finds highly sustainable in a way that it does not really do big damages to its balance of payments. So our analysis shows that unless oil prices increase 100, 110, 120, any level below that is an irritation, but something that's manageable. So as I said, this outlook is of the worst that could have happened, but things are really still not back to the pre-pandemic level, and many structural challenges persist, which will continue to weigh on the outlook in coming years. And what do I mean by that? So the 4 challenges that I've written here. First, global trade outlook has been in retreat for the past decade or so. And though we saw a few months when global merchandise trade suddenly picked up, but things are still not looking very good. And the forecast for 2023 is that it's going to grow only at 1%. Debt levels around the world have become very high. When I say around the world, it includes 3 groups of countries: low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. Debt levels are high in each set of countries. And what we have here on the slide is general government debt to GDP ratio, which has increased from 77% 20 years ago to more than 110% today. General government debt to GDP ratio has also increased in the emerging markets and middle-income countries. So what implication does it have? The implication is that most likely countries will have to start consolidating their deficits and debt rather than being able to support growth fiscally. So if anything, fiscal policies will now subtract from growth rather than being a catalyst for growth. It also has implications for climate transitions. If debt levels are as high as I'm projecting here, then where would the additional money for climate transition come from? As I said, inflation has still remained high, which means that interest rates will remain high. And the real challenge with inflation would be seen in a couple of years from now, when let's take the case of the US. If inflation comes down to 4% or slightly above or below 4%, but not down to 2%, the inflation targeting level, then what does it mean for their monetary policies going forward? So that's the real test of the monetary policy frameworks that we will see in a couple of years. Until then, inflation will decline slowly and monetary policies will remain tight. Banking and non-banking financial firms have been doing well for now. But again, the IMF has cautioned that there may be risks in the non-bank financial part, what is also called the shadow finance, and it will be seen how they withstand a slowing economy, high government debt, but also high interest rate environment. Now, these global developments, they impact India. Gone are the days when we used to say that India is decoupled from the global economy. As the economic survey has also talked about it, India does get impacted by a number of developments that happen outside its borders. The closest one is the trade elasticity of growth to the global demand. And it's, I don't even want to say that it's as per our analysis, because it's a very simple co-movement of growth rate of Indian merchandise exports with the global demand. And it just co-moves. The elasticity is 1, which means that if global trade environment is going to be subdued, it has implications for India's own export of merchandise. Interestingly, this chart you may not have seen before, even India's investment growth rate co-moves with the world growth rate. Now, it's not implying any causality, but one can think of the channels whereby global investment sentiment can impact India's investment sentiment. The other ways in which the global economy impacts India, and some of which we saw in the calendar year 2021, when a whole lot of capital was withdrawn from emerging markets, including from India. We saw the impact of monetary policy in the US on India, including through the reversal of capital flows. And we know that oil prices impact India directly, both through the trade deficit, its impact on inflation, its impact on growth, and at times even on exchange rate. So in the midst of this global outlook, how has the Indian economy done during the past few years? So Indian economy has started to recover from the lows of the pandemic. All components of GDP have more than surpassed their pre-pandemic levels. Growth is projected to be 7% for 22-23, slightly lower at 23-24. But even then, growth for 3 years averaged at less than 2%. So these are the 3 years of the pandemic and slight recovery from pandemic, which means that there have been real implications of that health crisis on the economy. Among other positive news, inflation has started to reverse as well, which will ease up the burden on monetary policy. Among other things on the outlook, the balance of payments has started to normalize. So 2022 was the year when there were multiple shocks impacting the economy, multiple global shocks impacting the economy, which also had implications for India's balance of payments. And these shocks, some of them I have already mentioned. Capital flows reversed from India, oil prices were very high. Exchange rate depreciation was a part of coping up with these global shocks, and reserves were used along with exchange rate to make sure that balance of payment shocks were handled in a rather prudent way. Now, again, balance of payment has started to normalize. Those global shocks have ebbed. Merchandise trade deficit is the only variable in the balance of payment which is still increasing. Services trade surplus has always been quite resilient to both the global economy and to the global trends, and that has continued to do well. Remittances are doing very well. The World Bank has projected that India will receive about $100 billion in remittances this year. Oil deficit has started to decline because of the decline in oil prices. As a result of all this, exchange rates have started to normalize. They are now below the levels that were seen when the economy was coping with these global shocks, and reserves are being rebuilt. So the story so far seems pretty resilient, that there were big shocks happening last 4 years, the worst is over globally. Some structural issues will remain with us, which will impact global growth. India is very much a coupled economy. It does get impacted by what happens outside, but overall it has done well when it comes to growth rates last year and this year, when it comes to the resilience of the balance of payments. So the union budget was prepared and presented against this backdrop. Against the backdrop when the global environment is still soft and uncertain, and the Indian economy is slowly normalizing. So what can I comment on the budget, besides giving this backdrop? So I'll comment on two things in the budget, the macro assumptions and the reform announcements. The latter part is easy because there were hardly any reform announcements. So my comments will be on the first part, the macro assumptions in the budget. So one key assumption on which the media gets a little hyped and it keeps asking people who choose to go on their channels is 10.5% nominal GDP growth assumed in the budget a reasonable number? And the answer is absolutely. Just as in the last year, many of the assumptions in the budget are highly conservative. So this 10.5% can be unpacked into 6.5% real and 4% deflator growth. And there can be upside on both. There can be a slight downside or upside on the real growth rate, but certainly a possible upside on the deflator growth. Either way, to the extent that nominal GDP growth is agnostic of these two components, 10.5% is eminently possible. If anything, it can be 11 or 11.5%, as was the case this year. The actual nominal GDP growth turned out to be much higher. Other key assumptions in the budget are on gross tax revenue, 11.1% of GDP. Again, is it a reasonable assumption? Yes, in two ways. First, tax buoyancy has improved in the last year and a half as the economy started to open up post-pandemic. And second, if we look at the historical numbers, as well as the realization of last year, 11.1% looks fairly reasonable. One big thing that everybody has talked about in the budget is reallocation towards capital expenditure. So capital expenditure to GDP ratio has increased from, it has doubled, increasing from 1.7% in 2013-14 to 3.3% budgeted for next year. And you can look at this reallocation in a number of ways. It is a definite, clear, significant reallocation. But then fiscal deficit is also projected to consolidate to 5.9% of GDP. Is that an achievable number? Absolutely. But is it a great number? Not necessarily. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, like in every other country, we looked at how globally public debt ratios have increased. And there's a counterpart chart to that where deficits have increased around the world. Similarly, in India, fiscal deficit increased to 9.2% during the pandemic, and it is the slow way down from there. And this slow decline is because of what I call a sticky fiscal math that we confront globally, but certainly in an emerging market such as India. So interest payments, so one fallout of the high deficit and debt numbers that we have currently is that interest payments exceed capex. So we looked at the capex number, 3.3% of GDP. Interest payments next year are projected at 3.6% of GDP. Interest payments exceed 40% of revenue, and there has been a slight increase over the past decade, which means that when your public debt to GDP ratio, a consolidated one of about 85%, is to be financed, despite the fact that a lot of public debt is held by domestic institutions, is long-term and is denominated in rupees, a large part is held by government-owned institutions. Therefore, the interest rates remain rather stable. The fact of the matter is 40% of your revenues, this is for the central government, but a similar figure is obtained when you combine both the debts. Interest payments, 40% of revenues are used for interest payments. Public debt declines very slowly in any country, especially emerging markets, and the same thing is true for India. So if you look at the budget this year, the central government debt to GDP ratio, despite all kinds of normalization we talked about, is projected to increase slightly next year. If I'm not wrong, from 57% to 57.2%. It's a small increase, I understand. The point I'm trying to make is, with all the normalization, public debt to GDP ratio is not declining as per the government next year. Similarly, if we just superimpose this budget estimate onto the state debt to GDP ratios, the ratio is likely to remain above 85%, with its implications for interest payments that I just talked about. We have also been doing some simulations at NCER, looking at, so there are three key variables that are important to look at the trajectories of public debt: primary deficit, nominal GDP growth, and interest rate that is paid on the government debt. So our simulations assume...
We have 1 more minute?
I'll take 2 more if it's okay. So under normal assumptions, that the kind that have been laid out in the budget or past 10 years or 5 years, this debt to GDP ratio is not going to decline. The 2 simulations that we have where they will decline are the ones which assume a nominal GDP growth rate of 13%. Or a primary deficit below the kind that we have seen in the past or the kind that has been projected in the budget. So similar analysis for central government and general government, but let me come in the last minute and a half on the key announcements in the budget and how they support the 3 growth scenarios that have been laid out in the economic survey that was supervised by our CA, Anant, who has graciously come here and is chairing the session. So the 3 scenarios that have been put out. One is the business as usual scenario. in which, based on the strengths of the ongoing reforms, the Indian economy can continue to grow at 6.5% a year in the medium term, which means that this scenario is not conditional on any new reforms in the budget or otherwise. It's based on the payoffs of the last reforms that have already happened. Second is that you widen the scope of reforms to a few new areas, which can help accelerate the growth rate to 7 to 8% a year. Now, the question is whether this budget made headways into these areas of reforms. I'm not sure. The third is, can we actually aspire to grow at rates higher than 7 to 8%? It's kind of implicit in the survey, and perhaps it's not, but my reading was that it will need to leverage global markets, global technology, global finances, foreign direct investments, much more. Now, it's clear that this is one part on which we didn't see anything in the budget. So my summary of the budget is, it's a traditional budget which has used fiscal allocation as the main policy tool, right? So it's a good budget in that sense. If we just keep our expectations right, it's a traditional budget, it's about fiscal allocations, then it's a great budget. It's transparent, it prioritizes capital expenditure over revenue expenditure, and its assumptions are realistic. All the things that I talked about. Yet the hard reality of sticky fiscal math will remain with us. Revenues to GDP ratios do not increase overnight. Expenditures, once increased and accounted for, it's very hard to bring them down. And interest payments are what they are, which continue to eat up a larger and larger proportion of your budget. The budget had few new reform announcements, especially the missing ones are which leverage global markets, capital, or technology, or the kind that unleash private investments. But then, let's be optimistic. Key policy announcements need not be confined to the budget. And the reason to have the CA here exactly is to do that he will help us make this narrative for reforms and policy actions throughout the year. Thank you. Before I go, I'll just leave you with one chart, which is the manufacturing growth rate projected for 22-23 at 1.6%, when the economy is growing at 7%. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam. So as you can see here, it's not just a fiscal math that overshoots.
This one is just damaging.
Okay, so I now invite Dr. Kavita Rao, Director NIPFP, to take the stage.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I would like to spend maybe 10 minutes and make up for Poonam's overshoot a little bit. So let me see, what do I think about the budget and what are my key concerns. I think the first issue that everybody has been talking about is, or appreciation, is for the fact that we see fiscal consolidation firmly on the agenda. Not just for the present year, but for 25-26, sticking to the timelines that have been pre-announced. So that's sort of commitment. That's, in a sense, a good reflection of fiscal marksmanship. But turning away from that broad number, if you look at the fiscal marksmanship going down, the heads of receipts and expenditures, we have been the image is a little more mixed, and we'll come to that in a minute. The second big plus for the budget, again, as frequently reiterated, is that CapEx has been given a huge boost, and this is being done in order to support growth in the economy. The challenge last year with government spending was that while center did more or less meet its projected numbers, the states didn't. The states were sluggish, let's call it, for a variety of reasons. So that we hope looks different this year. So there is additional allocation to incentivize states with zero interest loans, and one expects to see a better scenario. The third element in that set of public sector capex is PSUs, and the situation there doesn't seem as as positive. So one question that we should be looking for answers for, and I think some commentators have indicated that PSUs plus central government put together, we are not looking at an increase in capex, but that is a question that we should be looking more into. The second issue that I think in capex is interesting and different is the emphasis not just on roads and railways, but this passing reference to replenishing the fleet of vehicles in government. So there is a reference in the budget speech to providing adequate resources to replace 9 lakh vehicles or something to that effect. There's a large number there. So we might see a different impact of capex compared to earlier years a little bit. Big question that I think we all should be asking is, does capex necessarily mean employment generation? And here I have a question mark, because I think bulk of capex happening in the country now tends to be more capital intensive. So we don't build roads with labor, we build roads with machines. We do bulk of the investment, which is investment driven or capital driven. And so we hope that the demand for cement and for steel will in turn have second and third round effects, which will generate the employment that we hope to see. So in terms of employment, therefore, I'm not expecting dramatic stimulus coming out of the budget. Turning to the other elephant in the room, like Poonam said, we all believe that if revenue expenditure has been increased, it's often difficult to reduce. In real terms, the government hopes to reduce by not really increasing revenue expenditure very much. So the bulk of the increase in receipts has been allocated to capex. So if there are, in the continuing uncertain world, if there are changes in demands, for instance, there is one story doing the rounds about whether adequately resources have been adequately provided for NREGA. So then you would expect to see a reallocation within revenue expenditure. And that is what I mean by relatively weaker fiscal marksmanship, or alternatively, very nimble policy making. We can see it from both those perspectives. But I think that is what I expect to see in this year, given that we have almost frozen the amount of revenue expenditure we are providing for. There should be room there because of the reduction in in the subsidies for food and fertilizer, but yet, if there are under provisions, that's the risk we run. I'll turn to taxes for a few minutes. The first issue about taxes is the states have repeatedly expressed concern about not being given their fair share of resources. While the Finance Commissions postulate 42% of shareable resources to be given to them, the net amount the states are getting is about 30-odd%. That number seems to remain in the same ballpark. So that concern, once again, doesn't get addressed. In the bigger picture of the government needing more resources to finance its deficit, and therefore not creating larger deficits, it's important for the union government to hold on to these sources of revenue. But going forward, there is perhaps a need to re-examine this allocation of resources. Then coming to the only major tax announcement that has happened in the budget, and that is increasing the thresholds for the new income tax regime for personal income tax. What do we expect the consequences of that to be? I would expect the consequences of that to be twofold. One is that fewer people will be paying taxes. And if it is an important issue for the governments and for the country, for a large number of people to be a part of the tax base, then this is a question that this is a policy prescription that I'm very uncomfortable with. Does it necessarily ensure people will switch from one regime to the other? No, it doesn't. It provides a nudge. It provides a default option, but it doesn't necessarily ensure that we have switched. So the question that I'm trying to answer is the baggage of two regimes, how long are we going to carry it? This is an important question because it doesn't make the tax system simpler. It just makes it more complex. Each time I have to review my decisions on whether I want regime 1 or regime 2, it just makes things a little more complex. So if you're trying to simplify, then perhaps there is a question over there. The reason why I'm asking this is if you look at corporate taxes and the information that's provided in the revenue foregone statement, for last year and this year, we find that the share of companies in the old tax regime has gone down, but the share of income being reported in the old tax regimes has not gone down. And but still we are looking at 70% of the companies reporting taxes or preferring to remain in the old tax regime. If we do plan to have the two regimes in place and continue to or assure the citizen that these two will continue to remain in place, I think we have on the one side a slightly more complex regime, and on the other side we don't get the gains that we propose to get by shifting to an exemption-free regime. So I think at some point we need to revisit the need for two regimes. On the customs duties, we've basically had some tinkering. Every year we do have some tinkering. There are big goals and small goals which the government seek to achieve, and some of them happen through the tax system. I won't spend too much time worrying about it. There are a couple of things that I found very interesting in the budget. One set of measures went through the digitalization of public infrastructure route, which can be very interesting going forward. One is on creating digital public infrastructure vis-a-vis inputs for agriculture. And the other one, which I think was very interesting, is in the skill space, where we are proposing to set up a portal where the users of the skilled workers spell out what they seek by way of workforce. And so there is a better convergence between the supply of skilled labor and the demand for skilled labor. I think that was an essential element that was missing in the earlier skilling exercise, which we are seeing now, so that's a great movement. The other set of issues which directionally I think are important is for countries to start investing in R&D, because the push for R&D is where IP, intellectual property, is created, and a large part of wealth creation comes more through IP than through pure manufacturing and services. So the push for R&D in pharma, R&D in 5G, AI, even in agriculture, I think are welcome steps for, and even I think green hydrogen, are welcome measures to push for the creation of more R&D in the country, which I think in the medium term is a more effective strategy for economic progress. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita Rao. I think she did deliver on the chronological budget consolidation. So we'll now invite Dr. Deepak Mishra to take the stage.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, NCER, for inviting and organizing this event. And it's a privilege to share the podium with 5 of my fellow economists. So many of you who have been following Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's budget for the last 5 years might have seen a pattern in her budget announcements. Often her budgets tends to be credible, have credible projections, fairly realistic assumptions, quite balanced allocation, and a good dose of transparency. And if you're a critic, you would say the budget tends to be much more incremental when it comes to reforms. So there's not many big bang reforms that the budget has. And that's the pattern that I have followed the budget for the last 2 years, but every time I go back and look to the historical numbers, it seems like there is this. And the 23-24 budget kind of lived to that expectation. It was not very different, except I think when it comes to balancing, it did a much better job than the past ones. So when I had to write a post-budget article for IDEA for India, I called my article Some Good and No Harm Budget, and I'm going to stick to that title for my presentation. So today I'm going to talk a lot more about growth and specifically on trade and external sector, the work that I'm doing with one of our research analysts, Sanjana Shukla. In the presentation also there are some discussion on the impact of the budget on jobs, on MSMEs, and on digital economy. But because of lack of time, they won't be covered in the main presentation. We might come during the Q&A, or we'll post it somewhere so that you can see our observation on that. And those contributions are coming from Dr. Radhika Kapoor, Dr. Tanu Goyal, and Dr. Mansi Kedia, 3 of our senior faculty members in ICRIER. So with that, let me just quickly get into the backdrop of the 2023-24 budget. I think we all, and we saw Poonam's presentation, that India was the bright spot in an otherwise doom and gloom global economy. Second, India is assuming G20 presidency, so it will be in the midst of a lot of global diplomacy and leadership. And the third and the fourth, which are not focused or explicitly stated, but very much focused on the budget, was that while our corporates are doing well, and the stock market until the Hindenburg report hit was doing pretty good, but the micro was pretty fragile. So the rural economy, the informal sector, MSMEs, youth, women, there's a fair bit of distress in that part of the sector. Second is many of the structural constraints before the pre-COVID times have not been addressed. So while the twin balance sheet problems may have been repaired, slowdown on trade and competitiveness of the manufacturing sector is an issue that has remained. So if India has to go back to a higher growth rate in the future, it has to address those constraints that were there even before COVID came in. So it's in this backdrop that the budget was presented. And what I called in my article in the IDEA Forum is that every budget has to face this budget trinity of trying to achieve high growth, trying to improve distribution or have more inclusion, and at the same time, try to ensure there's this macro stability. And any budget can be evaluated from this framework in 2 ways. First is, how much weight did the budget put to these 3 priorities, given the constraints at home and abroad? What are the issues that was facing the economy and how this was weighted? And second is, within each priority, what kind of programs and packages that you announced which would add up to achieving those objectives. And based on this, and you can see more of that in the article there, is that the budget has been pretty good when it comes to balancing those 3 objectives. As you saw in my previous slide, you could not in this budget focus on one particular priority too much because there are multiple constraints in which the economy is operating and the global economy is not very favorable. So you got to weight all 3. So in some sense, when you look at the expenditure allocation, when you look at the schemes and program announced, I thought it was fairly balanced in its weight to different priorities. But what it fell short is the programs and packages within each priority. And here I'm going to focus on the growth and the trade issues. And that's where some of the binding constraints to growth and trade were not addressed. So let's get into that. For economists, in order to do anything, you need a framework to understand how do you take this budget announcement, which has many pieces to it, and look through it to say, does it provide enough answers to growth? And I'm making sure that my time is...
No, you have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, no, I know. Okay, so any economy which is trying to achieve sustainable prosperity and natural well-being has to focus on 4 capitals. So you need dynamic forms to produce those private capital. You need public capital to ensure there's efficient allocation across infrastructure. You need high human capital so that your workers have the education, health, and the skill to perform in the 21st century. And you need a low carbon intensity growth process so that your natural capital is preserved. So if you take this framework and look at the budget, clearly the budget scores a very high mark when it comes to public capital. We heard about the increased capex and many other things. I think it's also clear, and I'm sure when my other speakers will talk about, that it did fall short on the human capital. There's not a whole lot that you could see there. One could say that some of the human capital responsibility lies with the states, and the center could not have done much, but clearly that's one part that didn't figure out as much in the budget. When it comes to natural capital and private capital, you could see there's a mixed results over there. But because we need all the four cylinders to fire at the same time for the growth and the sustainable growth to happen, you need to do that. So in a sense, there is a disproportionate weightage on public capital and perhaps not on human capital. But then when it comes to growth, and I'm going to focus more on the private capital and the trade side, trade has been such an important part of the growth process for any country which wants to grow faster. And in India case, the trade has been fairly stagnant over the last few years. So if you just use the trade number and project what India's trade would have been today compared to its past, and the past was obviously we had a very buoyant trade in the early decades of the century, and so did the world, and which was the period of hyper-globalization. And the world entered a phase which is called globalization. And so you cannot obviously project that number. So what I did was I took 50% of the growth. So if the trade was growing at 50% of what it grew in the first decade of the century, where would trade be today versus where it is today? And what you find is there's a gap of $700 billion of missing trade. So in a sense, we are nearly $700 billion less trade, and that's export plus imports. And you can imagine the job impact, the growth impact of this and the economy. So why did our trade stagnant, and what could the budget do about it? I think the first is we heard a lot about that India is now a coupled economy with the world. So if you go back to the 70s, 80s, you find that the correlation between India and the world economy, which is the left graph, was negative. So when the world economy will do badly, India would do well, which is like a strange thing to do. But in a closed economy, you could have that. When India opened up in the post-1991, you have what you would expect, a significant, positive, strong correlation between India growth rate and world growth rate. So in 2023, world is going to grow at 3% or even less. So that would mean just by this bilateral correlation, you'll find India growing at 5.5%. So clearly there's a lot of headwinds from the global economy that is making it much harder for India to grow at this point. The second reason why trade slowed down in the last few years is what I call the great pause. India used to have this, huge number of trade agreements since 1991, and especially in the 2000. And then we had this massive pause on all our trade agreements for a couple of years. That meant that a lot of Indian exporters were at a disadvantage when it comes to market access with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world was continuing to integrate very fast rate, like Bangladesh or Vietnam, with the rest of the economy. But thankfully, this is reversed. Now we have signed a trade deal with Mauritius and UAE and Australia, and the discussion with UK and then EU. So this is particularly one which is starting to get, this constraint is being lifted. Then what is the third thing, and this is where the budget comes into picture. The budget has, for the last few years, has taken a very protectionist stance to ensure that there is a lot more domestic production and import substitution in the economy. So this looks at the change in tariffs between 2016 and 2021 at 2-digit HS code. So you can't see the x-axis because there are 91 numbers over there, but you can assume these are, and I've arranged them in a decreasing order, and you see there are lots of sectors where tariff has increased dramatically over the last 5 years. And the red ones are the labor-intensive manufacturing items, which is ad hocly just put together to show that many of the areas where the tariff has increased are actually labor-intensive manufacturing items, which presumably areas where India should have a competitive advantage to the others. But this was done largely because of the massive imports coming from China, and that was a reaction to slow those imports and give a breathing space to the domestic firms to produce more. But is it working? So if you look at this, tariff increases have really not translated into lower imports, and that's the picture on the left. What you find, so this picture looks at the change in tariff in the x-axis and the change in imports at those two-digit HS code, and what you find is the relationship is fairly insignificant, and if anything, it's positive, in the sense that areas where the tariff increased more, we imported more, and could be because a lot of those are fairly inelastic in demand, like vegetable and fat, oil and fat, where you need it for your domestic consumption anyway, so you import irrespective where the tariffs are. So clearly the tariff policy of increasing tariff to provide the protection doesn't seem to be working. If you look at, is it succeeding in keeping our trade deficit in balance or in check? And here you do see that there is, until 2021-22, this was a dramatic decline in trade deficit. And so clearly, if a government comes into power and looks at these numbers, they have to do something. And the reaction was, let's slow this import growth down and bring our trade deficit into check, which it seems to have worked for the few years, but after the COVID, it has got reversed. So India this year will end up having some of the highest trade deficit in the last few years, but thankfully because of remittances, because of good service trade, it's not a big deal now as it was during the fragile fight period of 2013. But at the point is, we haven't really achieved reduced imports. We haven't really managed to keep our trade deficit in check. So with that, you would expect that the budget would start to say, since it's not working, should we take a pause, or it starts to reverse? But sadly, the budget doesn't do it. It offers more of the same. So first thing is, as I think somebody said, the budget did not do much on the trade side. It did reduce the basic custom duty slab from 21 to 13, but it did increase duty on 8 items, which adds up to about $12 billion imports, and those items are here. So now we have tariff rates going as high as 70% in some of the items. And then it reduced duty on 10 items, which are often the intermediary and raw material, so that was a good thing, but that only adds up to $2 billion of total imports. And inverted duty structure for at least one item was reversed. So clearly, it was a very small, modest step on the trade side, and you would expect, if you go back to the data to see what really is working. Okay, I think a minute and a half. Okay. So what does this mean for the big story that we are talking about, which is the $5 trillion economy? So if you take the numbers that the budget has and project it, India is not going to become a $5 trillion economy by 2025, but I have 3 scenarios here. Scenario 1 is whatever it takes to get to the 5 trillion by 25. Scenario 2 is if India grows at the same rate it was growing in the last 22 years. Scenario 3 is if India grows at the rate it was growing in the last 10 years. So it'll take the longest. So S2, scenario 2, you hit the target in 27, 28, and scenario 3, you hit it in 28, 29. So what are the underlying growth rates behind those numbers? And this is growth rate in nominal dollar, not in nominal rupee, not in real growth rate, but dollar. What you see is we need to grow at 14% for the next 3 years to become a 5 trillion by 25, 26. You have to grow around 9% to get there by 27, 28, and 6% if you're growing at the same rate as the last 6 years. So that seems like a pretty steep curve to mount, but there is hope because India did grow at double-digit rate for 4 to 5 consecutive years, and for that you have to go back to NDA 1. And there was a period when India did that, and you also had a few years of UPA 1, but that was more of a spillover of the reform effect of NDA 1. So what happened, and this is my last slide, I think if I take the domestic reform, the x-axis, and external liberalization, y-axis, and I put them into 2 by 2, weak and strong, we started in 1991 with both domestic and external economy in a very weak spot. Both started to happen, this domestic reform, external liberalization, in 1999. Then from 1919 to 2004, which I believe is the golden period of Indian reform process, you actually had tremendous progress both on domestic side and on external liberalization. Then when UPA 1 and 2 came, we had a reversal on domestic reforms because there's a policy paralysis, especially UPA 2, but there was continuous improvement on the external liberalization, which is a bit of a bad thing to do because you want to have domestic reform to take advantage of external liberalization. So you did one side. Then when NDA 2 came in, we did the reverse. We did a lot of domestic reforms and we closed the external liberalization. In fact, we regressed on external liberalization by raising tariff. So if we want to go back to a double-digit growth rate for 4 years or 5 years consecutively and hit the 5 trillion economy, my solution or suggestion is that we should go back to the same reform trajectory that NDA 1 did, which is to have both strong domestic reform and gradual liberalization of the external economy. So with that, let me conclude by saying, I think the budget did a great balancing act with respect to the 3 budget trinity: high growth, more distribution, and securing macro stability. There was uneven emphasis on the 4 forms of capital that needed to achieve sustainable prosperity, so a lot more on public and a lot less on human capital. Action proposed in 2023 budget will not fix a structural stagnation in the trade sector, which was the focus of my presentation. Without buoyant trade, India will not achieve the 5 trillion economy, but there is hope. And the hope is if India can find a way to simultaneously pursue strong domestic reform and gradual liberation of the external economy, as it happened in NDA 1, we could hit the target in the desired timescale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepak. And I invite Mr. Nishant Chadha to make his remarks.
Thanks. So it's my job to talk about human capital, as Deepak's already suggested. And so, between the 1st and 10th of February or so, I never tell anybody what I do, because people often ask me, budget mein kya hua? I have no answer. Because, so I tell them ki mera pocket money nahi bada, but I think this time everybody's pocket money has increased a little bit. But I'm going to stick to not talking about short-term things. I often talk about education and health and research. And that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to, as Deepak already said, I'm going to put it a little bit differently, which is that there's a lot of consistency in our human capital spending. And when I mean human capital, I mean investments in people, right? That's what I'm thinking about. So we call it the social sector expenditure in the budget, but I think it's more of investing in the people, and hence I'm using the word human capital. So when we look at, so this is actually over the last 5 years, and when we look at some of these numbers, some of these increases, as I said, there's a fair bit of consistency here, right? So compared to the revised estimates, both the education and the health expenditure, and education here includes school and higher education. There's some increase. So, for example, in education, there is about a 3% real increase over the budgeted expenditure. There's a higher increase over the revised expenditure, but that's because in schooling, we couldn't meet our budget expectations and falling short primarily in the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, which is essentially the central government scheme providing infrastructure at the school level. And similarly, for health, there is actually no real increase over the budgeted expenditure, but that's understandable. Our health budgets over the last 3 years have been considerably jacked up, so that part is not surprising. But again, if you look at the revised, if you compare the budgeted expenditures for next year to the revised estimates for last year, there is a significant increase, and that again is because of some schemes, for example, I think it's called the PM Swasthya Suraksha Yojana, but it's essentially about building new aims in the various state capitals where there has been an shortfall in expenditure. So obviously, I think this was mentioned by Kavita earlier, that we are making, overall we're making capital expenditures in education, health, we're making capital-like expenditures, but we don't seem to be, the states don't seem to be doing a good enough job of it, right? So the pace of that is not, I guess, up to what was expected. As I said, this is over the last almost 5 years, and these are the increases, not in nominal terms, in our education and health budget, right? So education is about 5% and health is about 7%. So as I said, there is Deepak already mentioned one sort of fly in the ointment here, which is that education, health, the central government doesn't actually spend a lot of what the country spends, right? So, for example, I think in education, the union government spend is less than 10% of the overall public expenditure on education, because a bulk of it is made by the state governments. And therefore, given this sort of structure, it's difficult for me, and I struggle to figure out what is it that the central government should do. I mean, they spend on what the institutions they maintain, and therefore, if you look at the expenditure made on one Kendriya Vidyalaya school and compare it to a state government school, there's huge variation. But, that's it. So they do it. And because I think, I mean, as an economist, I think the central government should spend on things which have significant spillovers across states, or they should spend on things which require significant coordination across states. Providing schools doesn't require either, because it is best done by a government which has the most information about it. So the state government should, or local government should do it. It makes sense. So I think one of those things is, which I like about these budgets over the last 3-4 years, is that there's not a lot of money, but there's a lot of value placed on some of these experimentation. So one of the schemes, for example, that fell short in education is a scheme called Exemplar, which is essentially building 15,000 schools across the country to illustrate how the NEP will be implemented. Not much, I guess, was done on it last year. But a scheme like that might be a good example of what the central government could spend on, because then, however, we need a plan to take those 15,000 schools to whatever a few lakh that we have overall. So, what I did is, as I said, I'm free from, unlike the Deepak, Poonam, and Kavita, I'm free from having to talk about short-term stuff, which I don't know much about. So what I do is I do these various thought experiments, and I look at some of this stuff. So what I did here, no, it's not a thought experiment. So what I've done is, see, these education and health budgets, fortunately or unfortunately, are not guided, the investments are not guided by markets, right? Unlike all the other three, you get immediate response. You'll know what to do or what not to do, and you might still want to go ahead with what the market thinks you should not do, but that's some response you get. Here you don't, right? If you have a plan, you stick to it. And so over the last 15 years, our average growth, this is real growth, in health budgets is 10%. In health expenditure, the central government health expenditure, and education it is about 7%. Not much different. But it actually, it's interesting if you look at what the previous color of government used to spend on and what the UPA government spent on and what the NDA government does, right? So it's an unfair comparison because it's 5 versus 10. I didn't go back 10 years for the UPA. I could have, but I didn't. So this is 2009-10 is where this would start. And so, and you see a complete flip. So the UPA, you had a 13% growth in education expenditure, about a 7% in health. And health, till 2014, we were spending a lot less on compared to education, right, as a proportion of the GDP. It has now caught up. They are both about 3% of GDP. And so what has happened in the last 10 years is that we've flipped it, right? So we consistently, however, and that I think that's a good thing. So this government has a plan. We consistently spend more on health, and so we have increased that by about 12% annual, right? So this is the annual growth rate that I have, those bars are the annual growth rates, average. And 5% is for education, right? So, again, you know, as I said, like something that I thought was interesting. But again, to me, it's good that there is consistency that there's a plan behind how you're spending on health, right? So there's some infrastructure spending, there's research spending, and then within this budget, there's also something that is touched upon, which is nursing colleges and generation of some employment. So that's one, and then within this I point out before as well. So if you look at within education, as I said, there's a school expenditure, and then there's higher education, and we consistently in this government there has been an increase by about 4 to 5% on average on higher education, right, versus school. So till 2013-14, school used to be a larger proportion of expenditure a larger proportion of education expenditure. It's now higher education. Again, I like that because I think that if I look at which levels of education have more spillovers, then it is the higher education, and therefore it's also more capital intensive. And if you're spending money on building institutions, it's not a bad idea for the union government to be spending more than its proportion on higher education. But again, this is an opinion, but that's what I have had on the screen was a fact, right? So we do spend more on higher education proportionately. So this is what we have done, right? And I think the question really is is this going to be enough? We want to be a $5 trillion economy, 25 years, we want to be a developed economy, and if we want to do that, our labor productivity has to be about 3 times, if my PPP numbers are not wrong, about 3 times where we are right now. So we are not talking about a 10%, 20% increase in productivity. We have 25 years, but we have to be about 3 times as productive as we are right now. And India has a unique problem, which is that we are not as unproductive as it seems, because our labor force participation is one of the lowest in the world, because women in India don't participate in the labor economy or are allowed to participate in the labor economy. Whichever way it is, we have a very low labor force participation rate. So we not only need workers to be much more productive, we also need to put more people into jobs, right? Because innovation is always labor saving. That's why we innovate. We innovate because we want to complement labor. There is no other kind of innovation. Technology is always labor saving, which means that it's going to make tasks done by machines cheaper than tasks done by people. It's what happens. And ChatGPT can write very good code. I don't know if you've seen this, but it can actually write very good code. So if you train something like ChatGPT on 20 years of code that TCS has written, you can actually do a pretty good job writing standard code. It's not very difficult. So this is a reality. It's going to happen, right? So we have to create jobs and productive jobs in this scenario. So we don't have the luxury of waiting 10 years and then growing slowly, and at that point putting people back into jobs. And I think there's another problem which we don't focus a lot on India, is that India doesn't do very well in training and scaling up people at the upper end of the distribution. Actually quite well, if you look at this room. What we don't do a good job of is actually training and scaling people at the lower end of the distribution. And Michael Kremer has a fantastic first paper, and unfortunately did not continue that line of work. It's called the O-ring theory of development. And it's taken from the O-ring theory. The O-ring is a washer. Okay? It's a washer that was used on the Columbia spacecraft, the one that in '85 exploded. And it was a $1 billion project. They couldn't figure out what went wrong, so they called in Richard Feynman almost at the very end of his life to figure out what had happened. And what had happened was that they had a washer that was a 12-cent washer that could not withstand the temperature changes and cracked, and because of that crack, there was a $1 billion project. Right? So the idea is that productivity is multiplicative. People work together, they don't add productivities, you multiply them. So if you put a productive person with an unproductive one, your productivity falls dramatically. And what I mean by that is that unless we bridge the gap between our high skill and low skill workers, it's going to be very difficult for us to build an economy where technology is actually meaningfully used. Are we doing that at the lower end? Unfortunately not. And I don't think it's a problem of throwing money at it. Our private schools function at a fraction of the cost that a public school costs us. And if we believe everybody, then in fact, parents who send their kids to private schools too, they do a better job of educating our kids than public schools, which are, as I said, about 3 or 4 times as expensive as a private school to manage, the cost of providing education, right? So our education needs a fix, but we need a plan. I don't think it's a question of throwing money. We don't know what to spend money on. We keep building, and yes, we need toilets, and we need good buildings, and we need boundary walls, but they're not going to solve our problem. We don't have a solution to this problem, right? Unless we have one. And what we've decided is that, as an economist, I agree with it. I mean, if private schools are better at providing education, it's more efficient to let them do it. So why spend more money and get lower returns? Spend less money and get higher returns. That's what I would do too. So, and I think that seems to be what is happening right now. We have a stable growth path to education expenditure. That's the plan. I don't think it's the right one, but that's what we have right now. On employment generation, the budget did talk about, I think talked about a fair amount of stuff, with the caveats that Kavita mentioned. How much of this will translate to jobs, and especially not going to happen in the near term, and how much of it does translate, we'll have to see. But there's capital expenditure that will continue. We're talking about developing tourism, which is actually one of the labor-intensive service sectors, where it is unlikely that technology will completely replace people. So that's actually not a bad idea. It's a great sector to spend money on because technology complements labor very well in tourism. And so does it in health, right? So this idea of having 156 nursing colleges that are joined or sort of, I think, co-located with hospitals, again, I think is a great idea because we don't have enough health workers, not just doctors, we don't have health workers at all levels. So having people that can actually complement, like an AI doctor, is not a bad idea. It's a great idea, I think. It's good employment generation, and health is one of the things that actually increases in consumption expenditure as people become richer. So then, there's talk about artisans and business facilitation for women SHGs. Again, not a bad idea. And I think we never say this out loud, but we've kind of been running a wage subsidy program for the last 7-8 years because our skilling program is essentially a wage subsidy program, right? The government spends about 25% of what, hiring an apprentice. That's actually a wage subsidy at the lower end of the distribution, yeah. So I think that the budget does, it had to, it's a year before, to the election. Jobs and employment is a serious problem. But I don't think it's a short-term problem that we are facing, and it's a structural issue. Employment generation is a structural issue across the world. And we have the same problem, right? Because we're getting into headwinds. It's not a problem that will be solved here and now. This I don't understand. I think all this is good, but then. We come to training people and sending them abroad, which we've done quite successfully for the last 50, 60 years. But I think we don't have skilled people. Training them to send them abroad, I'm not saying people should go wherever they get high returns, but we're doing the same problem. We need to try and keep skilled people in our economy, not send them to others. We need skilled people much more than anybody else, actually, at the moment. So I really don't like this approach of sending people abroad and training them with our money. I benefited from it, but and then and I like some of the things. Again, the approach I think is a much better. So for example, so on research and development, there's a couple of there are more announcements than I have here, but I really like, the first one I like because of the approach. I think it's a great idea to allow, private parties to use capital infrastructure that has been developed for R&D but is lying idle. There's no point doing that. There's no point reinvesting. I think one of the constraints that India does have is capital expenditure, especially in science and technology research. So use of ICMR labs by private parties, I don't know how much of it will work, but I think it's a great idea. And then we have, Kavita mentioned this, we have some centers for AI intelligence, 100 5G application development centers with a focus on agriculture, health, and related sectors. Again, I think there's a lot more that I did not talk about here, technology. And the last one is, again, there is some mention of the National Data Governance Policy, which again, I think is fantastic because data is actually a true public good if it is invested in by, created by public money, right? So I'm going to stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Nishant. So thanks. The last speaker is Dr. Yamini Aiyar, President CPR.
A few years ago, really not very long ago, I was the new kid on the block in this tradition, both because I didn't have as much gray hair as my fellow colleagues, and since none of them are here, I can say that, but also because I was very new to heading a think tank. And the only uncertainty in times of uncertainty is that things change and you grow old, so the gray hair is showing up, and I am, I think, the oldest member of this tradition on the dais today. So in keeping with the tradition, I did want to very warmly welcome everyone. Nishant started this tradition a year after me, I think in 2019. And ever since Deepak and Poonam, we had these Zoom traditions over the last 2 years, which mercifully we are out of. So in-person welcome, and Kavita, very warm welcome. And of course, Chairperson, the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Anant Nageswaran. So very warm welcome on my behalf. And maybe it's time for me to move on and do other things. But clearly, my colleagues have also ensured that they've given me, as the oldest member of this tradition of today, the hardest task, which is to speak right at the end when all that needed to be said has been said. And now I have to repeat everything that you've said, but try and make it sound as though there's something new and insightful in what I have to say. My role, or rather CPR's role in this tradition, has usually been to focus on the underlying political economy dimension of what shapes the budget. And I think a lot about questions of state capacity. So as I was looking at the budget and knowing that I'd been given this hard task and that all that would be useful to say had already been said, I thought it might be best to try and take what we know now as we've tried to unpack the budget and place it within the framework of the limits of the Indian state and its capacity. I think everyone in this room will agree that there's much to be done to really create a competent 21st century state for India. And all budgets have to be made within the limitations that the constraints of weak state capacity place upon it. So where have we come to, and what are its long-term implications on our understandings of growth? I'm going to focus on 3 issues: revenue mobilization capacity and its limits, implementation and absorptive capacity, and third, on the federal vacuum. Let me start with talking about revenue mobilization. All speakers before me have rightly pointed out that this budget has continued in a tradition over the last 3 years, especially after the 2019 budget, of coming firmly on the path of fiscal consolidation and increased transparency, getting rid, almost till this budget with the FCI, of the old practice of off-budget borrowing, moving slowly and carefully despite the pandemic towards fiscal consolidation, towards a path of fiscal consolidation and reducing fiscal deficit, and in that process, managing within the limits of revenue that has been generated. This budget, I think, takes it a step further in that, in the attempt to enhance capital expenditure, it does a very important shift in how it manages our deficit. Revenue expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure comes down, as you can see, from 84.37% in 21-22 to 77.77%. I think over the last 6 or 8 years, this is perhaps the first time that a consistent effort has made to reduce revenue expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure, and importantly, reducing the revenue deficit to fiscal deficit ratio from 59.61% to 48.68%. It has been done, as many before me have said, and is very much in the public discourse, at the cost of reducing social sector expenditure, which is down as a chart below, to which I have to give credit to my wonderful colleagues at Accountability Initiative, CPR, who've been mining social sector data for the better part of the last 15 years. But for the first time, budgeted expenditures for social sectors dropped to 18% of total expenditures, total government expenditure. So there is, perhaps, because of course of the constraint that Poonam pointed out, a reality in which choices have to be made, expenditure switching has to take place. And one element of that reality is that we are simply unable to raise our tax ratio as a percentage of GDP and have failed to do so consistently despite a fairly focused attempt at trying to improve efficiency of tax compliance. Since we're amongst friends, I might say maybe we'll do better at ensuring tax compliance if we spend less time focusing on tax compliance of researchers, but don't tweet that and I'll leave that. The second issue relates to implementation challenges. It's well known, the Indian state has been described by Lan Pritchett as the flailing state. We now argue about whether the state is flailing as much as it was in 2009-10 when he first coined that term. But it's well known that we suffer from very significant implementation challenges. Budget allocations never quite match revised estimates. There's often a huge gap, and actuals are even lower, more often than not. And even as we have embarked on the path to technology and DBT and improving many aspects of our public finance management systems, this remains a challenge. And I will say I'm pretty convinced that our policymakers and those who manage budgets know this better than I do, so they budget very cleverly to allow for all of this. So there's been a lot of talk about capital expenditure. There has been a marginal drop in the revised estimates of capital expenditure of last year. Releases amounted to 65% of utilization. Kavita spoke about the role of CapEx, sluggish CapEx at states, the PSU CapEx reducing quite significantly, which has offset the current big number. All of that, in my view, is sensible budgeting when you know that you have significant implementation constraints. And this implementation constraint, it gives you a nice headline, but it ensures that there's a lot of room through the year. And this implementation constraint is not restricted only to big infrastructure. It's even more significant in the context of welfare spending, rural infrastructure spending. Here are two schemes, just to give you a sense. The Prime Minister Awas Yojana Gramin, which was allocated 20,000 crores at the start of this financial year. There was a huge boost given in the revised estimates to 48,422. By the way, the claim that a significant increase has happened this year is correct if you compare BE to BE, but not that significant if you look at RE to BE. But 59% of this money had been released in January 2023. And it's important to know that 90% of funds available, that includes unspent balances from previous years with states, have actually been utilized. So there is space now for states to receive more money. Releases are very slow, and there are many reasons why releases are slow. They all have to do with the complexity of the labyrinth of the Indian state and how difficult it is to move papers and to get monies released. Samagra Shiksha, education, and keep this number in mind because I'm going to come back to it again and again. Please excuse me, I'm passionate about education. Schools were closed for 2 years. I have 2 primary school going children. They sat on my head for 2 years. They've learned nothing. So I've experienced it personally too. We have not increased our expenditure much. Nishant before me has spoken a lot about this. But the important thing is schools opened in April of this year. Samagra Shiksha deals with elementary schools. Only 60% of the allocated funds for last year were released, and utilization rates are as low as 22%. In a separate exercise with USAR, we have for many years tracked what monies reach schools for small-scale infrastructure development at the school level. They're called annual composite grants for schools. Year after year after year, only 50% reach schools halfway through the school year. This has a very, very significant impact on small things that matter for schools. Those small things include whether you have a proper functional blackboard, chalks, places for children to sit on, furniture, etc. All this matters to the overall implementation, and when schools are closed for 2 years, you know that the basic infrastructure inside is crumbling. So these implementation challenges essentially create a context in which releases are unpredictable, expenditures are low, and essentially the budget ends up being a little bit of a smoke and mirror game, and you have to dive quite deep into the budget to really make sense of where money is actually going. Have there been any significant changes? And mostly you find that it is status quo. One important piece too, we've spoken a lot about the challenge of capital expenditure and employment and whether increased capex will really move us in this direction. I remain somewhat skeptical, and Kavita, I think, has pointed this out, so I won't repeat it. It would be good to have data to put pay to all our skepticism. But again, when you look down deep into the budget data, for example, the big push on railways, about 40% of that is for stores and workshop manufacturing suspense, which is not necessarily for new projects, but for ongoing stocks and production that are already underway. So there are careful attempts done within the budget to manage it within the context of the implementation challenge. The federal vacuum, a very, very nice effort in the budget to continue a process that began last year, which had to do with the 50-year interest-free loan window that opened up for states. Now, we've already spoken about the fact that states aren't jumping. State capex was slow. States often use this money as substitute. But it raises a really important federal question. When the union government makes a determination of a prioritization, to what extent does it bring states on board to play along? And I don't think we do have sporadic meetings, many of which people like us are not in the room for, and so we do guesswork looking at budget numbers. But it doesn't seem entirely clear to me that that coordination mechanism has worked particularly effectively. There is a huge federal vacuum in terms of arriving at collective goal setting. We've also spoken repeatedly whenever we speak about expenditures in health and education that these are essentially state subjects. I couldn't agree more, but Kavita pointed out that despite the 14th and 15th Finance Commission, state shares in the divisible pool, the gross tax revenue, have stayed within the range of 30%. India's fiscal federal architecture, to me, is far more deconcentrated than decentralized. States depend on center for money. They spend a lot more. Most of their money is tied to wages and liabilities, especially for things like health and education. We have long sat on this unfortunate practice of states waiting for centrally sponsored schemes and demanding them when they are reduced, of the center increasing centrally sponsored schemes as the tool that it uses to get states to do things. This is far from ideal, but this is the way it is. And in that, this is the way it is, the question has to be asked about who should hold some degree of accountability for important expenditures in this direction. What center tends to do when it gets frustrated, rightly so, because states don't play ball very well, is to constantly create these incentive mechanisms, which again, to my mind, is more deconcentration and devolution. It's done this even in parts of the 50-year interest-free loan. If you look at the chart on the left, and I would request the CEA to please help us understand this a little better, but my reading of it seemed to suggest that many of the the released amount is far lower even than the approved. So again, something's going on here related to implementation. But also parts of what was to be allocated linked to the incentives doesn't seem like states are jumping. So something is wrong. Something is wrong in terms of the ability of the union to incentivize states to move in this direction. And it seems to me that there is a complete breakdown of coordination, and we need to think hard and harder about what are the best ways in an integrated economy to ensure that center-state coordination, negotiation, and collective articulation of goal setting actually effectively takes place. And it would not be a bad idea to have incentives, if we are going to go down this road, for health and education spending, which to my mind still remain about the most important thing we need to do for the future of this country. If the world is going in the direction that it is, you cannot have a situation where 50% of children finish 5 years of schooling and still can barely read standard 2 textbooks. There is an urgent need to invest there. So finally, in all of this, perhaps because we have low revenue raising capacity, we have to make difficult choices. So we choose within the limits of what we have, and we say we will look at more capital expenditure, be more transparent about it, manage our fisc better. We try to incentivize states, not very effectively without a federal structure, but we are moving in that direction. Those are choices we have made. And as a consequence, we have completely failed to invest in human capital. What worries me more about this is that our implementation capacity challenges never come up when we expand CapEx hugely, but they always come up when we talk about spending for welfare. So we have said, for example, that by reducing funds for NREGA, we have expanded funds in other aspects of rural infrastructure. If you just look at the last 3 slides there, it is true compared to the past. The last 3 bars here, in 2021, 22, 21% of total social sector spending was allocated to housing, urban development, and water and sanitation that occupy the big bulk of what is infrastructure spending in the quote-unquote social sector. But in this year, it is in the coming budgeted estimates, it still stays static at about 20% of total social sector expenditure. So it's not increased manifold in the way in which it has increased manifold for capital expenditure. Lots has been said about NREGA. It is absolutely true that NREGA is a demand-driven scheme. We've seen, particularly in the last 2 years, when demand increases, the government does significantly increase in the revised estimates. But just 2 things to think about. The pending liabilities in NREGA today still stand at 8,499 crores. We have not got enough money for the action that has happened on the ground. Also, the elasticity of NREGA, it expanded, it contracted, it expanded. It shows you that this is a scheme which actually reaches despite all the limitations of state capacity. Wages are lower than non-rural, non-agricultural rural wages. 70% wage payments are delayed, so there is more that needs to be done there. And the one thing, as somebody who spent a lot of time looking at NREGA, particularly at the state governments, that slow allocations in the beginning do, it incentivizes states to ration demand, which is always a huge challenge. And most of the other infrastructure schemes, PMGS, Sarak Yojana, Awas Yojana, Jal Jeevan Mission, don't adequately make up for that. And I will end again, I promised you I will rant a little bit about education with one more point for why the choices that we are making in the long run are actually undermining the potential of this country than enabling it. This is data from the latest ASAR survey, which looks at enrollment in government schools. Enrollment in government schools in 2022 went up to 72.9% on account of the pandemic, compared with previous years where actually people were moving, households were moving to private schools. To my mind, this is a huge opportunity. It tells us 2 things. In times of stress, the public system for education, and by the way, even for health, but we don't have good data for health to make this point, so I'll stay with education. The public system is a system of last resort and only resort. Today, you have more children in school than ever before. This is the opportunity to actually invest public trust in the ability of the system to actually deliver quality schooling. We always say it is a surprise in a country like India that there is no political will for education because there is no demand. Actually, people are demanding good education. I was just in a school in Delhi 2 days ago. Their classrooms are now have 70 children to each teacher. There are so many children, they need more funds for infrastructure. This is an opportunity that we've lost or missed in this budget. There's always time in revised estimates because there's a lot of space there. I don't think we'll meet our CapEx at the rate at which we hope. So can we consider a little bit more in education? And yes, it should be for the states, but then the center too has to be true to the devolution requirements that are laid out in the Finance Commission. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to Poonam for inviting me to be the moderator for this session. You could call the 5 people on the stage with me as economists, by and large, and they would agree that when it comes to competition, we all like perfect competition and also fair competition. But here it's a case of 5:1, so it's unfair competition. So having said that, in general, we know that thinking people worry. But it doesn't necessarily mean that thinking people have to worry, or for that matter, those who don't worry are not thinkers. So we should be very clear about the distinctions here. Now, very valid points have been brought out by all of the 5 speakers. One is that, let me start with Poonam's remarks that interest payments as a percentage of total revenue are around 41%. Public debt will decline only very slowly. And there have not been much of reform announcements in the budget, which of course Deepak said this is sort of part of the pattern that incremental reforms are announced in the budget and it sticks to a steady path. Of course, he spoke about the external trade and the aspects related to that. So generally, if you look at the budget, there is one announcement that hasn't gotten the kind of attention it should have got. One is that if someone has to make a payment to a micro, small, and medium enterprise and doesn't make that payment on time, then that business entity, whether it is public sector or private sector, cannot include that in its total expenditure and claim tax deduction for it, as they normally do in terms of business expenditure. You can do so only in the year you actually make that payment. So you cannot delay the payment and yet show that as an accrued expenditure and compute your taxable income. That's a very important step that has been announced. And also, if you look at some of the ease of living or ease of doing business reforms, such as common business identifier or one single touch point for updating your Aadhaar numbers or addresses, and also for KYC, etc. On a day-to-day basis, people spend a lot of time on these things and repeating the same information to multiple government agencies. And those have been addressed in the budget. So I think what is important here to note is that the bulk of the product market, external sector, financial sector reforms have been done in the previous 20, 30 years. And therefore, whatever that needs to happen, A, are by definition incremental in nature, and B, many of them do lie in the realm of states as well. Now, we also make 2 statements at the same time. Perhaps we do not appreciate the contradictions that is inherent in those statements. We talk about the fact that allocations have gone down, but we also say that allocations have not translated into outcomes. Then why are we worried about not having enough allocation? We have to make sure that outcomes are effective. So let's say, for example, about 37 years ago, a former prime minister said only 15% of the government's spending reaches the ultimate beneficiary. And today, for example, therefore, somebody finds out that, okay, if 1 rupee I spend, 15 paise goes to the beneficiary, I will bring it down to 40 paise or 30 paise and make sure that 25 paise or at least 80% of that or 30% of that, 90% of that go to the beneficiary. Actually speaking, the money in the hands of the beneficiary has probably doubled. But the allocation on paper would have come down from 1 rupee to 30 paise or 40 paise. So on the face of it, you may think the allocation is down by 70 or 60%, but the money in the hands of the beneficiary has doubled. So you take a look at, for example, the PM Kisan in the budget, it is on paper, it has come down. But the reason is, as stated blandly in the budget speech, but I'm sure you can make out, the database has been updated. The database has been cleaned up. Ineligible beneficiaries have been eliminated. So no eligible deserving beneficiary will go without the PM Kisan payment, but the system has been cleaned up. The second example, let's take the allocation to Manrega, which of course Yamini correctly pointed out in the previous years when the actual demand went up, they were met and revised estimates were higher than the budget estimates. That is one part. Yes, it is a demand-driven program. It will be therefore met if there is a demand. But why does the budget assume that the demand will be lower? You look at the allocation to PM Awas Yojana Rural. It is 172% higher than the budget estimate for 22-23, And also the same goes for Jal Jeevan Mission. Now, obviously, you can't build affordable homes or, for that matter, continue with the Jal Jeevan Mission implementation without having rural workers participate in that initiative. You can't build houses without labor. So therefore, the expectation is that much of the labor will be absorbed in these programs, and therefore, the demand for rural wage guarantee will come down. And second, there is also an expectation that as economic growth continues to sort of steady itself and proceed further at the rate of 10.5%, 11% in nominal terms, then certainly some of the surplus rural labor will be absorbed into urban construction projects, etc., leading to lower demand for wage guarantee programs. That is why the allocation to Manrega is lower in the budget estimates. Similarly, let's take a look at the health expenditure. We forget that in 21-22, about 35,000 crores was the allocation for vaccination. And if you take that out, it was only about 49 or 48,000 crores expenditure without the vaccination, which was a one-off event. So from 48,000 crores in 21-22, without the vaccination being taken into account, it has gone up to 86 or 87,000 crores. So important to remember, therefore, two things. We are working to make sure that outcomes are improved all the time, leakages are plugged, and that is what direct benefits transfer has achieved over the years. And allocations do take into account evolving economic circumstances, and we need to continue to focus on outcomes as well. Dr. Kavita Rao spoke about the fact that it is 41, not 42, 41% as per the Finance Commission, but the effective ratio of revenues that goes to states is not that much but lower, but it has been the case over the years as well. One has to compare also the growth rates of the the revenues that are devolved to states. And it has always been the case that what is allocated by the Finance Commission and what actually goes as a share, because there are other the total revenue doesn't not just include tax revenue. So if you look at the gap between the two, it has always existed, and therefore it is important to take into account the overall growth in the revenue devolved to states. And then when we look at social sector expenditure, given the fact that most social sector expenditure is shared between states and the union government, it is important to look at the general government expenditure on social sectors, not just the central government expenditure. And if you look at the general government expenditure on social sectors like health and education, they have picked up significantly, and hopefully these allocations do satisfy some of us who look for allocations, and hopefully they do translate into outcomes as well. And then about the implementation and the state capacity, again, these are enduring issues and challenges, and given the political economy constraints that normally hobble such issues as state capacity, etc., given all of that, we do have to remember that similar skepticism was indeed expressed when back in 2002, the Golden Quadrilateral project was announced. But that had indeed set the stage for the kind of expansion and progress in public infrastructure that we have seen over the last 2 decades. And second, while several countries, even advanced and some not so advanced, made a hash of their vaccination programs, this country not only managed to achieve its vaccination over a population of more than 1 billion people, 2.2 billion doses and counting, but also managed to export its vaccines and help others as well. Third, we all know that several countries take weeks and months to declare the election outcomes, and even then it is still contested. But we do declare them within 24 hours to 48 hours, and these are done seamlessly election after election. And if you look at the rate of growth at which highways are built on a daily basis, or for that matter, the number of airports which have doubled in the country, we have shown that infrastructure spending can be ramped up. If you look at 21-22, allocation was 6 lakh crores, 5.92 lakh crores was spent. And in the case of 22-23, it is 7.5 lakh crores, and the budget expects that we would end up with 7.3 lakh crores. Yamini did bring out the fact that some states have not taken up the allocations tied to incentives. That is an ongoing process. Some states are not ready, some states are ready. So even it is public policy making to sometimes we have to understand that it is an entrepreneurial exercise. There will be hits and misses. You have to try multiple things and you have to shelve those that don't work and figure out the next possible way to make it happen. It is a matter of deploying both carrots and sticks. And secondly, there are always lags between actions and responses. Because many of these things, whether inside the government or outside, do require behavioral change, and we cannot expect them to happen at the speed with which we can tweet about them. And lastly, I would also say that if you look at this issue of old tax regime and new tax regime, it is very clear, according to Revenue Secretary, that more than 61% of the corporate tax filers are indeed have switched to the new tax regime. And as far as the individual taxpayers are concerned, it is very clear that as long as you don't have business income, you have the right to switch between old and new year after year after year. There is no limitation on the number of times you can make a switch, whereas for corporate taxpayers, it's only once. You can make a switch one way and another switch back other way. After that, you have to stop. But for individual tax filers, if you don't have a business income to declare, you can keep switching between the two options depending on the deductions you have. Some of the youngsters may not be wanting to own houses and claim property interest payment deductions. And even those who have options to save, in general, we know that the propensity to save is much higher at higher income levels. And that is an empirical fact across countries. But if you look at the fact that if you have to have a 9 lakh rupees, if you have an income of 9 lakh rupees per annum, pre-tax, and if you have to match the amount of taxes you would pay under the new regime, which is only about 45,000 rupees, in order to achieve the same 45,000 rupees of taxes under the old regime, you have to save about 1.87 lakh of rupees to achieve a break-even between the new and the old tax regime. And even that 1.875 lakh rupees, you have to do it in multiple instruments, ATC, some insurance policy, and some other certificates, etc. It takes effort. And we know that lower income people do not have that much of surplus to save. So the point is, options are given, and in a democracy, if you expand the optionality to citizens, I would expect that it should be welcomed. Because after all, you are not restricting options, but increasing optionality here. And finally, in terms of the fiscal deficit and deduction and debt parameters that we have in this country, and many people have talked about the slow reduction, and I thank Yamini for pointing out that the revenue deficit to fiscal deficit has come down, and in fact, the revenue deficit reduction across the last 3 years has been much more meaningful than in the gross fiscal deficit, the headline number that we all focus on. And yes, we also say that in the last 3 years, the combined growth is only about somewhere between 2 and 3%. And that kind of explains why the deficit ratio has been slow to come down. We cannot say that the growth rate has been only cumulatively around 2 to 3%, and yet talk about the fact that the deficit ratios and debt ratios have been slow to come down. That is the explanation. And therefore, the fact is, as we have shown in the survey, if you can grow at a realistic 10% per annum on a nominal basis, even for 3 years, the deficit and debt ratios will come down meaningfully. I will leave you with one more information. Between 2005 and 2021, if you go to the BIS database and look at the countries whose general government to debt ratios have gone up or gone down, India is one of the very few countries between 2005 and 2021, including the pandemic year. The gross general government debt to GDP ratio has gone up from 81% to 84%, barely 3 percentage points. Indonesia and Germany are the other two countries whose debt to GDP ratio at the general government level have gone up as little as India's has. But several other countries, developed and developing, have seen the massive expansion of debt to GDP ratios. These are publicly available statistics. So the point is, there is always a lot of work to be done. And it is the case as a country that moves from lower middle income to upper middle income country, there will be always enduring challenges. There is no washing away from that, and I thank Poonam for pointing out that the economic survey does mention several of these reforms that still need to be pursued between union and state governments. And they will be pursued at different speeds. It may not match our expectations, but the fact is I would leave you with this article by Mr. Sudipto Mandal, who wrote an article in November, late November in Mint. If you get hold of it, please see it. We have to abstract from all the noise and all the commentary and all the hand waving and look at whether people in absolute terms, even in the most backward village or the most backward state in the country, have benefited or not. And Sudipto Mandal, having gone to a particular village in Chhattisgarh 40 years ago, goes back 40 years later, and he finds what has happened. I don't want to break the suspense. Please go and look for it and read for yourself. Thank you very much. And I'm going to now throw the floor open for questions. I hope they're not meant for me, but for my 5 distinguished colleagues here.
Thank you very much, Anant, for those very balanced, very articulate comments. Just to make it easier for Anant to manage the floor, when you ask your question, very briefly identify yourself. Tell us who the question is for. Please make it a question, not a comment or a commentary, and keep your question short so that we can invite many more questions. We have about 20 minutes.
I'm J.K. Bareja from Delhi University. My question is to Dr. Anant. One side, government is talking about increasing the tax base. By increasing the limit in new tax regime to 7 lakh, 1 crore assessees will not be paying any tax. Number one. Your comment on that. And number two, the total number of GST assessees in India is just 1 crore 40 lakh. I think this number is too small for a country like India. Thank you very much.
Let's collect a few questions about.
Nishant, you said that we need to put more people into jobs, into productive jobs. Yes? At the same time, machines are cheaper than people. Now, there is a narrative change. What I want to understand is, we were talking of demographic bulge. Today, we are talking of demographic dividend. Manufacturing is growing at 1.6%. So where are the jobs? Where is the employment? In which sector?
Yamini and Kavita have mentioned that. Say that Finance Commission has recommended 42%, but actually it's much less. Dr. Anant has given a justification that because of inflation, the actual growth rate is much higher. But actually, Finance Commission, I happen to be associated with 3 Finance Commissions, and I happen to be associated in forecast of 3 kind of, revenue and expenditure for the states. But when you make that recommendation for state share, you do include both the inflation and possible growth. So, and it is mandatory on the part of the government to transfer that state share, and it should not justify in terms of inflation growth. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Surinder Singh. I teach social sciences at my own center. My question is to Mr. Deepak Mishra. I'm so sorry if I said the name correctly or wrong. I just couldn't miss the great pause that you talked about. And I saw in the year that it begins with the year 2014 and ends at 2022. Just a question. Do you think there is any political underlining other than the fact that we do not have a lot of free trade deals? Or what would be your opinion on why exactly it exists or why it caught your eye on? Thank you.
My question maybe Chief Economic Advisor can answer. Despite having, I think, robust political capital, why government could not mobilize much on disinvestment target? Because has that crunched the space for the space to reduce the Manrega and all that?
Okay, I'll just respond to the question on the trade issue. So, I don't have the slide in front of me, but yes, there was a pause starting around 2013, 2014, and then we have the Mauritius deal in 2021, so it was lifted. And is there a political overtone to this? So clearly, I mean, I've made some other presentation where it's so that, Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, just at the height of the, what I call the fragile five. So if you're running in a massive election campaign at a time when India was in a fragile five, and the reason for fragile five was India had massive trade deficit and current account deficit, it couldn't finance. So clearly, I'm presuming that you're asking your economic advisors what to do. And, some people would say, let's find a way to slow down the imports. Some could say, push more and find a way to. So clearly the decision at that point was we got to slow down because our trade accounts are unsustainable and we are in this bad category of called fragile five. So I can see the reaction at that point to it. But my point in the presentation was that after seeing the reaction to the policies over time and again, I think there's a good reason to now relook at the policy. And this is one area where top economists from different political stripe, and let's take Arvind Panagaria and Raghu Rajan on two extreme, both agree that this is not working. And that was the point I was trying to make. Thank you.
I'll just take 15 seconds. So yes, manufacturing does generate employment, as does services. Employment intensity of services is as high as manufacturing. So your point is well taken. All of us actually, not some of us, we try to say is that when you have three major sectors of the economy, if all three of them grow fast, you generate that much more employment. In fact, in some forums I have said that what we export is not just goods and services, we export labor as well, which can be a very important growth driver. I'm not as selfish as Nishant, that he benefited by going abroad, but he does not want others to go abroad. If the same individual earns 4 times as much outside, why not, right? The advanced economies are aging, and it is our opportunity to become the skill capital of the world. So therefore, all the announcements in the budget to that extent are welcome. My, I think, small pet peeve was that who's going to deliver on this? You have a budget allocation, but the delivery should be done more through the private sector than the government. And that was my point that I have raised in an op-ed that I've written. Over to you, Nishant.
Thanks. I think my response to your question would be that I don't believe it is the government's job to figure out which sectors are going to grow or will provide employment and therefore favor them over others through any means, because I think that's distortionary. What we can do and what we should do is there are a lot of non-budgetary ways to actually just reduce frictions, which is what I think Poonam is also referring to, that where employment is going to come from, I don't think it's the right time to predict that these are the sectors. I think tourism, health, some of these are outliers. We know that they employ a lot of people. But reducing frictions across sectors through technology or through reforms is absolutely the only way to go. Jobs cannot be created by the government. It's not our job, right? Nobody can tell you where to grow jobs come from. So I just want to support, I think, what Poonam said, that if the sectors grow, there is a natural movement between sectors. I think you will see agriculture will start losing people. It already has. It will have to. People move to manufacturing or services. And I think that one thing, and as Poonam said, our manufacturing doesn't actually create more, it's not more labor intensive than services anymore. So I think it doesn't matter where you spend the extra rupee. It's just the jobs created are the same or similar. So we just need to move people to high productive jobs. I think that's the very, very high level thing that I can say. I don't have any more insight as to which particular sectors would work better in terms of employment creation.
Very quickly, the number of people who will leave the tax net because the effective no tax limit has been raised to 7. They have done their calculations as to maybe the number of people who will go outside the tax net will be much more, but in terms of the amounts involved, it will be relatively smaller. And more importantly, as economic activity does indeed pick up, I think there will be more people coming into the tax net, and the tax to GDP ratio is not just about the number of people, but also in terms of the amounts that we collect with respect to GDP. And there, if you include the state-owned taxes, the overall tax to GDP ratio is somewhere between 17 to 18% of GDP, not just the central government taxes. And if you look at countries at a similar stage of development as India is when they were they were becoming developing countries and then later on became developed countries. So at similar stage of development as India's tax to GDP ratio is not on the lower side. And in fact, it is actually quite comparable. The next question you asked about the number of GST taxpayers, about 1.4 crores, you are right. But pre-GST, barely 4-5 years ago, that number was about 62 million or 66 million. So now it is 142 million, excuse me, that was about 6 million, now it is 14 million. So we have more than doubled the number of GST taxpayers, and you're also seeing the results in the average level of GST collections going through a step function. On the Finance Commission recommendations, I didn't say it was inflation. It is not that inflation is not taken into consideration or not. That is not what I said. I said devolution formula is well given, but if you look at the overall revenue, and then you look at the devolution to states, it will not be the same. But on tax revenues, the formula is strictly adhered to. But in terms of the overall revenue share, it is not the same as the formula prescribed by the Finance Commission. I did not allude to inflation. Then if you look at the question about disinvestment, it is not just a question of political capital, it's also a question of market conditions and investor appetite and interest, etc. And we should also consider what the governments are getting in terms of their dividends and other revenues from the public sector. So it can't be a mechanical decision. It involves many more factors and not just the political capital.
We'll attract a second round of questions, about 5, and this perhaps would be the last round.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you 2 questions. One is on the capex. So we know the big headline number, that is 10 lakh crores. But we have done this analysis, and I wanted to ask you what has happened. And this is my analysis. My question is whether you agree with this or there is some other way I should look at this data point. So what has happened in the last 4-5 years? The government has taken a lot of off-budget spending, capex and revenue both, on their own books. So eventually what was, for example, done by the NHAI has been taken by the government on its own book. What was done by IRFC probably has again been taken on its own book. So what eventually matters from the economic perspective is CPS's plus center's capex. So while center's capex, as one of the slides showed, has gone up almost doubled from 1.7 to 3.3% of GDP. CPSE's capex has declined almost half from 2.3 to 1.1. So if I look at the aggregate, it is budgeted at 3.8% of GDP, lower than 3.904% prior to the COVID areas. So my question is, I don't get so excited with the 10 lakh capex number because it is just a reallocation rather than, is this correct or not? Second, from the...
No, Nikhil.
Okay.
You took too long to give the context. Yes, Dr. Mandir.
Thank you. I had a question for Deepak. It was a lovely presentation, especially on trade and what has been happening with tariffs and so on. The question I had something I couldn't understand. In your initial framework with the three terms in terms of which you assess a budget, you said it was very balanced and including the inclusion part that had gone well. But later you talked about how on the capital, human capital part, we had fallen short and so on. And you didn't say, but others did, about the reduction in allocations for social spending, Manrega, etc. So where did you find this balance? That's the question.
Ekajan, my question is basically to Yamini. You mentioned about the declining importance being given to education and health sector. Under the Constitutional Amendment Acts, these sectors basically belong to the state governments. So whether it is right to blame and find faults with the central government budget, that's all.
What I want to understand is, will India be able to take advantage of in the manufacturing sector or what is coming out of China? Because of its, various policies, a lot of manufacturing units are moving out. So can India take advantage of that?
Kumar Sinha, question is for this innovation. You have just mentioned that in the MSME, payment is delayed. Then the payment will not be allowed as expenditure to the buyer, and it will be allowed when the payment is made. This provision will also be applicable to the MSME if he is the buyer. In that situation, that MSME will be hit double hard, and he will have to pay the GST and also the taxes. As his supplies will be there, it will be seized. So some provision should be made for the MSME sector, so not to be double hit this way.
Let's start from you, Yamini, if you want to take any of those.
Sure, thank you. I think I was asked directly about the center-state issue and the constant conundrum that we confront, that technically speaking and frankly from the point of view of all good first principles, health and education should primarily be state subjects. And the accountability for what is spent and how it is spent should rest firmly with the states. Absolutely. But we don't live in a perfect world. In the world in which we live in, the center has consistently over many decades taken on the role, by the way, education is on the concurrent list, but the center has taken on the role of, through the practice of centrally sponsored schemes and by legislating on these matters in Parliament, for example, the right to education, frame and shape how states, or how we as a country collectively, states and center, should spend on education. The center has not given states untied block grants specifically for health and education, saying spend where you want to. The center has created centrally sponsored schemes where it directs literally line by line by line how much money should be spent, where it should be spent on, and how it should be reported on. Right now, just as we speak, the union government has presented its budget. States will present their budgets after the fact without knowing in advance or when they were preparing how much the government of India was going to allocate for any of these centrally sponsored schemes. They discover it along the way, and then they come to the central government for the planning and budgeting meetings where allocations get determined. We live in a world which is deeply deconcentrated. Government of India has consistently over many decades, despite a lot of crying from states and attempts by finance commissions to change this, tied funds for these key things through centrally sponsored schemes. States want money, they don't want responsibility. So when centrally sponsored schemes get reduced, they cry hoarse and they ask for them back. They now have to pay 40% from their budgets for these schemes. And therefore, they have very cleverly used these schemes for the bulk of their expenditures that are not tied to wages and liabilities. In this reality, both center and state have to be asked and questioned for why they do not allocate and prioritize. And just like we are giving interest-free loans and incentivizing for power sector reform, for urban reform, for digitization, fiber optics, for CapEx, we could possibly, maybe, it's not ideal, I wouldn't recommend it, but if we are doing it for CapEx, we could also maybe think about it for health and education. The fact of the matter is, for some reason, we don't prioritize it, even though today more children are finding themselves going into government schools because incomes have suffered, and that's what they, and clearly families want to educate their children. Just one quick comment on NREGA. I think NREGA versus other rural expenditure schemes, it's a long and complicated question and argument to be had, but I think there are a couple of things just I wanted to just point out on this. One, NREGA utilization is over 100%. PMAY utilization right now, because funds, only 51% of funds have been released, is not as high as the revised estimates for the current fiscal. There are unspent liabilities still pending on NREGA. There are wage delays that are still happening on NREGA. The wages themselves are lower than non-agricultural rural wages. So there is, even in this limited way, a call for a little bit more funds than we currently have. Secondly, the fact that NREGA utilization is high suggests that the scheme, because it's just been around for a long time, states have got used to it, they've built out an implementation architecture. When it comes to spending, they are able to spend. And against the backdrop of continued distress, when we are making choices, some of these elements, I think, should also be factored in. And while the practice of revised estimates contributing to responding to demand has been met effectively for the last few years for sure, it is worth asking, at least from what I get in the time I spend with states, when allocations from the center reduce, because remember, this is a 90-10 scheme, states are incentivized to ration demand at the ground level. In an ideal world, labor budgets are supposed to be made from the panchayat level all the way up to feed into what the final allocation of the union budget is. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. It's all made on the back of estimations, and that is now creating its own cycle of confusions. So I think maybe there's something to be said for rethinking how we are looking at the rural economy broadly. We've got Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation doing its own thing, rural development doing its own thing. All of these things come together actually to shape what employment looks like at the rural level. And maybe all of these conversations need to happen together to look at the pros and cons of schemes and then arrive at what a sensible way of moving forward should be.
Thank you. Deepak, do you want to take China plus one and please be brief?
Very quickly, yeah. No, I think I wanted to just respond to this question that Sudipto had about so that's a very good question. Actually, I did think about it when I was preparing it. So, so when you look at the growth part of the framework, there's this whole thing about human capital, and obviously that's one part of the disparity that the budget is set in. But if you look at the budget, there are many dimensions of disparity that the budget was trying to tackle. Disparity on income or class, disparity on human development, geographical disparity, gender disparity. In fact, if you look at the budget speech, and we did a word cloud, 3/5 of the budget schemes are about the disparity part. So there's not so much money to it. The money part was on the growth side, but there's clearly a lot of announcement, and I think the maximum time of the finance minister on the budget was actually spent on what I call the more inclusion or great disparity. From that point of view, I said it's balanced, but when you look at it purely from a growth perspective, the human development seems to be lagging. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So, on the CAPEX question, I mean, I just wanted to point out that the reason why the government took upon itself some of the CAPEX in the previous years was that when the financial system was undergoing its own repair, naturally, there were risk covers, and only the most credit-worthy borrower, which happens to be the government, could do so. That was one reason, and therefore it made sense for the government to take upon itself the capital expenditure. And the second reason is that people said, well, what the government should be spending, it was putting it in the books of public sector enterprises, so the effective deficit should be much higher. I think you can't win either way. So, now, but the truth is, if you look at the statement 1 in the expenditure profile, the fact is, in terms of the provisional actuals for 21-22, it is 10.3 lakh crores, which includes the public enterprises capex as well, and 11.3 lakh crores for 22-23 revised estimates, and 14.89 lakh crores for 23-24, which includes public sector spending as well. So, as a percentage of GDP, it has gone up from 4.4% in 21-22 to the budget estimate in 23-24, around 5% of GDP, and we know that the denominator is expanding as well. Sir, as your point regarding the MSME payments, it applies to MSMEs as well. I will check the fine print. It does. I don't think so. It is the finance bill is very clear about to whom this applies, and only for payments to MSMEs. But having said that, I take your point, sir. And on China plus one, I think the thing is there are obviously at this point anecdotal evidence that it is beginning to happen, and of course we know the main newspaper headline companies. I don't want to repeat them, but that said, it is not just a factor of relocating because there are concerns and risks with China. People do still want to manufacture in China for catering to the domestic market over there. And there are other considerations coming into play as well. Just as they would have been making their decisions, interest rates went up in the United States, and they may be having their own earnings hit happening. So naturally, some of these decisions are subject to many factors, not just this one issue, because other things don't stay the same. And therefore, the speed with which some of this transition happens will naturally take into account the global interest rate cycle and the growth cycle and the concomitant risk aversion or risk appetite. Thank you.
Any last comments, Nishant?
Oh, actually, I've said it.
Great, thank you. So let me take this opportunity to thank Dr. Anant Nageshwaran for finding time in his very, very busy schedule and to be here for all of 2+ hours. Thanks to our wonderful audience to be here and the panelists. And there's lunch outside. Please do join us. And last but not the least, an amazing NCR team which worked behind the scenes to make it happen. Thank you.